We're going to be in Luke's Gospel this morning. It is going to come up on the screens for those of you who haven't. But I'd encourage you to bring them along, get stuck into them, make sure the preacher isn't talking nonsense. So Luke chapter 9, verses 28, we're going to start reading there. And it's entitled in my Bible, The Transfiguration. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they'd stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. So that's our passage for today that the lectionary throws up. We're in a period where we're just about to move from Epiphany into Lent, which starts next week. And so this passage sits between the two and kind of rings in the changes, the changing of the season. I just want to talk a little bit about change this morning and how is it that we can encounter Jesus amidst the change. We've all woken up this morning with, I guess, some element of change in our lives. We seem to do it a lot over the last couple of years. We've woken up to change in our lives, in our country, and in the situations that are going on in this world. It's been said that the only thing that never changes is change itself. And Heraclitus, some Greek philosopher, I think, he said this: the only constant in life is change. And sometimes, and even if we look back over the last couple of years, and even the events that have been happening with Russia and Ukraine, it's so easy just to kind of feel a bit dazed and say, what just happened? What just happened? Sometimes we experience change as good. Sometimes it's incredibly painful, but it always has consequences, good and bad. It always raises questions, and it always brings challenges. So how do we live in the midst of change? And in particular, in this moment, how do we live as Christians? How do we stay solid in our faith and in our witness to the world while the sand beneath us seems to be moving almost daily? Well, as we join the disciples today, they've just been told that Jesus, the one, if you remember, they left their nets to follow, the one whom they've seen do the miraculous, the one whom Peter has previously just recognized as the Messiah. He's also their companion and their friend. He's just told them a few verses previously that he's about to head to Jerusalem, where he will suffer and where he will die. The ground beneath them is shifting. Certainties are no longer, and change is taking place and will come more forcefully in the days and months ahead. And so in this context, as Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem, where he'll suffer, die, and be resurrected 3 days later, Jesus heads up the mountain to pray. You might, after this, just want to look in Luke 6 and see that when Jesus was about to choose these disciples, he went up the mountain and prayed. There's similarities that Luke is trying to point out to us. But this time he takes with him Peter, James, and John. And on that mountaintop, we have this event that maybe, I don't know, we're a little bit embarrassed about or don't quite have a framework for, but we have this event referred to as the Transfiguration. It's quite a hard thing to get our heads around. It is kind of embarrassing to talk to people about in some ways because we can't make rational sense of it, because what we read is Jesus went up and he was transfigured. He shone. There's this sense of the glory of God. So on one level, we perhaps have little framework for an event like that. And yet on the other hand, I suspect we all share something of the same sense of yearning that we might have an encounter like that. Now this text is full of richness. Luke and also Matthew and Mark in their Gospels hide in plain sight in these verses a bucket load of references to both the Old Testament and also to their own texts, all showing how Jesus is the Messiah. He fulfills both the law, that's part of the reason Moses is there. He fulfills the prophets, that's part of the reason Elijah was there. By the way, they believed that before the Messiah came, before judgment happened, that both Moses and Elijah, they'd never really died, and so they would appear. And so the fact that they're appearing points to something about who Jesus is and what he's about to do. He's the bringer of the new covenant. He'll bring his people from slavery into freedom. He's to be the new Moses. For example, the word here where it says Moses and Elijah were talking to him, they appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure. That word departure is also the same word as Exodus. And so in this passage, Luke is saying Jesus is the new Moses. He's the one who's going to lead his people out from slavery into freedom. Now that word transfigured or transfiguration, it means to transform into something more beautiful. That's what I do every morning as I get out of bed. Sorry, man. You're right, man. Good. But that's not quite accurate here, I don't think. Because whilst Jesus was transformed externally and visually, so the disciples saw something new, there was a sense in that Jesus wasn't being transformed in and of himself. He was already like the King of Kings, the Lord, the Prince of Peace, God's Son. He was already divine. And so what's happening here isn't so much a transformation as a transfiguration. His appearance externally is changing such that the disciples recognize more. They have an encounter more to understand who Jesus was, to understand not just his humanity, but his divinity and his glory. The vision that the disciples see removes the veil of Jesus' humanness to reveal his divinity in all its wonder, frightening, powerful, unexpected, and richness. Jesus' appearance is utterly changed. It doesn't alter who he is, but it gives to those who see the changed vision a new understanding of him. That's the point why we come to worship together, not just to sing songs, but to gaze on Jesus, to have something other of Jesus revealed to us in a new way. Now, this story marks a change in the narrative of the gospel. As from here, Jesus begins to set his eyes on Jerusalem and to his death. And I wonder if that's part of the reason Peter is so keen to build shelters. It's like he wants to preserve the moment, to stay atop the mountain and not move towards Jerusalem. Perhaps Peter recognizes that with the changes that Jesus is talking about, with the change that's coming in Jesus' direction, then that is going to affect him. And he's not necessarily up for that change. And yet, I also wonder if amongst other things, this event would help prepare and help Peter and the disciples to live through the coming change. The text hints at this. It says, they kept silent and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. And yet when we read Peter's epistle later on in the New Testament, we see him talking about this event and explaining what it meant. It's like in the moment, they know they've encountered Jesus, but they haven't got a clue what to do with it and what the significance of it is. And yet as time goes on, as Peter sees Jesus killed, resurrected, as Peter himself suffers for his faith and is ultimately put to death because of his faith, they begin to look back on this incident, on who Jesus revealed himself to be. And it gives them hope and courage. And so I wonder if this passage can help us do the same, if it can show us how to live in the midst of change. And there's 3 instructions the disciples receive here using this text and the parallel in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17. 3 instructions they receive. Firstly, listen to him. Secondly, get up. And third, don't be afraid. We've just been in a series called Finding Your Voice. And in the midst of change, we can be aware of so many voices clamoring for our attention. Some external, some internal, bubbling up from within. There's commentators out there. There's opinions. There's voices of judgment, fear, voices of self-doubt, self-criticism, denial, blame. But the voice comes, listen to him. The story here reminds us that there's only one voice to listen to. The voice of God, which here once again says, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased." Do those words sound familiar? What do they remind you of? Jesus' baptism. God spoke those words over Jesus at the baptism, except there they were only for Jesus. Whereas here, he's speaking to the disciples. He's affirming the same truth, but it's for the benefit of the disciples. This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased. And he adds, listen to him. As we've come or are coming out of a pandemic, as we face the prospect of conflict right across Europe, as we navigate changes closer to home and in our own lives, what if we listened to him? What if we took the time and space and developed rhythms and habits that keep our ears open to what Jesus is saying, that keep our eyes open to who he is and what he's doing, that kept our hearts soft and our gut ready to hear his desires and act on his concerns, and our hands and our feet ready to engage in the world in the way that he does. If we listen to him, it means we'll find his voice. And as we find his voice, we will find our voice as individual Christians, but also as a church. And it would mean that the voice of change and whatever it seeks to bring with it is not the defining word. It's not the final word. That belongs to Jesus. And it's a word of life, of hope, of peace, of mercy, of courage, of generosity, of healing, and ultimately of love. The church, we have a responsibility to listen to God's Son. The listening does not result in us staying aloof on a mountaintop where the air is pure and the view is stunning. The church is called to listen to the voice of God in the midst of everything that is going on and follow that voice in a way that we don't like because it's a way that leads to the cross. Listen to him. Secondly, in Matthew's account in chapter 17, we read that as Jesus shines, as the cloud of glory of his presence comes, they fall to the ground, overcome by fear. And we read that Jesus goes up to them and he says, "Get up." But that word, get up, it means more than just stand to your feet. A more literal translation would be something along the lines of be raised up, awake from the sleep of death, or maybe even be resurrected. Matthew, in fact, uses this same verb when Jesus speaks to the paralyzed man and heals him. When he raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. When he sends out the 12 to heal the sick and raise the dead to life. When he speaks of his own coming resurrection. And when the angel tells the woman who comes to Jesus' tomb, he is not here, for he has got up, for he has been raised. Jesus comes to us, encounters us in our uncertainty, in our fears, in change, on the mountaintop and in the valleys. And I think he wants to say to many of you this morning, get up. Not in a kind of get up, what you're doing, but be raised, be healed, be resurrected, be redeemed amidst the change. Be raised. And then he says, do not be afraid. Change often, maybe always, brings fear. And do not be afraid are the words we need to hear when we're back up on our feet and we're facing the reality of change. His words, do not be afraid, speak directly into our human condition. And you might say, well, that's easy to say, Jesus. Don't be afraid. That's really easy. Have you seen what I'm facing? But you see, we're not called to be fearless. We're not called to have no fear. Rather, we're called to be a people of hope and of courage and of life in the midst of change and fear. You see, we're called not to build tents, but instead to follow Jesus to Jerusalem. The significance revealed in the Transfiguration is to be the catalyst for our and the world's transformation. I'll say that again. The significance revealed in his Transfiguration is the catalyst for our world and for the world's transformation. That's what it did for Peter. It catalyzed this significance, this recognition, this encounter with who Jesus was in all his glory, that when times got tough, when he couldn't work out what was going on, he could look back to this event and recognize that Jesus was King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so maybe it wasn't Jesus who was changed on the mountaintop at all. Maybe it was Peter, James, and John who were changed as they had their eyes opened and their seeing changed, so that everywhere they then looked, they saw Jesus. Maybe in that moment they saw Jesus for the first time as he had always been. And that's what we do when we come and pray, when we worship. We aim to see Jesus for the first time. We've seen him many times before, but there's always more that he wants to show us and reveal to us. And so maybe amidst all this change that we've experienced and we're still wrestling with, that as we go into Lent, it's time to see again who Jesus really is. Through Lent, we're doing things like the Lent course, or you may have other things that you're following. But the point of that is a time, again, just to encounter Jesus. It's a gift from the church, in a sense, this season, this next 40 days, to refocus, to re-look again and have an encounter with Jesus. But notice it was Peter, James, and John who were up the mountain. There's a community who went up the mountain. It wasn't just about Peter. It wasn't just about James. It wasn't just about John. They went as a community so that they could share their experience, so they could encourage one another when the other one was down, so they could tell others about the experience and have it verified. And so how we do stuff together as a community is just as vital as how we do it as individuals. As we come together each Sunday, we can tend to come as just individuals, like getting stuff or chatting to one. The point is that we come together And as we come together, we encounter Jesus in a new way that we might go out into the world. And that's why Focus is such a good event, because it does something of that. It's taking time aside up a mountain. I mean, Newark's the flattest place ever, but taking time up a mountain to again, set aside time to recognize Jesus, but to do that in community. That's why we've got Refocus in a couple of weeks' time. Again, just to come and recognize not just Jesus, but one another, that we might go down that mountain into the world where everything is changing. Recognize Jesus for ourselves, that we might show the world who Jesus really is. Listen to him. Get up. Don't be afraid. I wonder which one of those three is most relevant for you this morning. Listen to him. Be raised up. Be redeemed. Be resurrected. Be refreshed. Or do not fear.